Nothing in your life is actually that hard, but the way you think about it makes everything feel impossible. Pause for a moment. Look at your life as it is right now, not the version in your head, not the worst-case scenarios you keep replaying, just reality. Is it really that bad, or does it just feel that way? Because there is something most people never realize. The life you are living and the story you are telling yourself about that life are not the same thing. You wake up in the morning, nothing dramatic has happened. Your job is still there, your responsibilities are still there, your opportunities are still there. And yet something feels heavy. A small task turns into pressure. A simple decision turns into overthinking. A minor mistake turns into proof that you are not enough. You're not just living your life. You are living a second life inside your mind. A life where everything is amplified, where problems grow bigger than they actually are, where fear shows up before reality does. And the most dangerous part is this. You believe it. You believe every thought that appears in your head as if it were the truth. That is where everything begins to go wrong. Not out there, but in the way you see it. No one ever taught you this. Not because it is complicated, but because it is invisible. You do not experience life directly. You experience your interpretation of life. Two people can go through the exact same situation. One sees pressure, the other sees opportunity. One sees failure, the other sees growth. The difference is not reality. The difference is thinking. But here is the part that quietly controls everything. You are not aware that you are interpreting. You think you are seeing the truth. You do not question your thoughts. You do not step back and ask, is this the only way to see this? Instead, you trust it. You react to it. You let it shape your emotions, your decisions, and eventually your entire life. And then you say, life is hard. But life is not what is exhausting you. The way you think about it is. Most of your suffering is not coming from what is happening. It is coming from what you believe is happening. The conversations in your head, the imagined scenarios, the fear of things that have not even occurred. You live the same problem over and over again. Not in reality, but in your mind. And every time you do, it feels heavier. This is how life becomes difficult. Not through action, but through interpretation. But there is a moment when everything begins to change. Not when life becomes easier, but when you start to see clearly. The moment you realize not every thought you have is true. The moment you stop reacting automatically and start observing instead. The moment you understand that there is more than one way to see everything. And when that happens, something shifts. Life does not suddenly change. The same work is there. The same people are there. The same challenges are there, but you are different. The pressure softens. The noise in your mind slows down. You stop fighting everything, not because you became stronger, but because you stopped making everything heavier than it needed to be. In this video, you're not going to learn how to control your life. You're going to understand the one thing that has been controlling everything all along, the way you think. Because when you truly understand this, you do not just change how you feel, you change how you experience your entire life. And when that happens, you begin to realize something very simple. Life was never as hard as it felt. You were just never taught how to see it clearly. And this is only the beginning. Chapter 1. The invisible lie that makes everything feel hard. There is a belief you have been carrying for most of your life. You did not choose it. You did not question it. You simply absorbed it. It was everywhere, in school, in work. In the way people around you lived, life is hard, and the only way forward is to push harder. At first, that belief feels strong. It gives you direction. It gives you structure. Work more, try harder, fix yourself, improve constantly. And for a while, it seems to work. You become more disciplined, more focused, more driven, but something quietly begins to change. You become more productive, but not more peaceful. You achieve more, but you do not feel lighter. You keep moving forward, but the weight never really leaves. That is when confusion begins, because according to everything you were taught, this should be working. So you assume the problem must be you. Maybe you are not disciplined enough. Maybe you are not focused enough. Maybe you just need to try harder. So you do. You push more, you think more, you try to control more. But instead of feeling better, everything starts to feel heavier, and at some point, a quiet question appears. What am I doing wrong? But here is the truth. You're not doing anything wrong. You're just operating from a belief that was never true. The belief that effort alone will fix everything. Because if effort was the answer, you would not feel this tired. If pushing harder was the solution, you would already feel free. But you do not. And that is not your failure. That is your signal. A signal that the problem is not in what you are doing. It is in how you are thinking about everything you are doing. Think about this. Two people can live the same life. One feels overwhelmed, the other feels clear. Two people can face the same challenge. One feels pressure, the other feels direction. The difference is not the situation, the difference is the way they interpret it. But when you believe that life itself is the problem, you never question your interpretation. You assume the weight is real. You assume the pressure is coming from outside. So you try to fix the outside, a better job, a better plan, a better version of yourself. But no matter how much things improve, the heaviness follows you because it was never coming from your life. It was coming from the way your mind was processing it. And this is the invisible lie. You think life is hard, but what is actually happening is that your thinking is making it feel hard. This is why everything feels heavier than it should. Not because life is crushing you, but because your mind is constantly adding weight to it. Every situation becomes a story. Every problem becomes bigger than it is. Every uncertainty becomes something to fear. And the more you believe those thoughts, the more real they feel. Until one day you cannot tell the difference between reality and the story. Your mind is telling about reality. That is when everything feels overwhelming. But the moment you begin to see this, even just a little, something starts to shift. You stop asking, how do I fix my life? And you start asking, why does everything feel so heavy to me? That question changes everything because it moves your attention away from the outside world and into the one place where real change actually happens. Your mind. And that is where everything begins to open up. Chapter 2. The interpretation loop that controls your life. There is something happening in your mind right now that you rarely notice. It is automatic, it is fast, and it feels completely real. Every moment of your life follows a quiet pattern. Something happens. You interpret it, you feel something, you react, and then that reaction reinforces the way you interpreted it in the first place. This is the loop that most people never see. The interpretation loop. It runs constantly without permission, without awareness, and once it starts, it keeps feeding itself. A small event happens. Maybe someone does not reply to your message. That is all that actually happened. Nothing more. But your mind does not stop there. It begins to add meaning. Maybe they are ignoring me. Maybe I said something wrong. Maybe they do not respect me. Now the feeling appears anxiety, doubt, discomfort. And from that feeling, you react, you overthink. You check your phone again, you replay the situation, and every time you do that, you strengthen the original interpretation until it no longer feels like a thought. It feels like reality, but it never was. It was just the story your mind created. This is how something small becomes heavy, not because of what happened, but because of what you added to it. And the most important part, you do this all day in ways you barely notice. A simple task becomes pressure. A conversation becomes something to analyze. A delay becomes a problem. Your mind is constantly trying to make sense of everything. But it doesn't just explain reality. It reshapes it. It filters what you see. It selects what matters. It fills in gaps with assumptions and then presents the final version to you, as if it thoughts were the truth. But it is not the truth. It is an interpretation. And interpretations are shaped by patterns. Patterns built from your past, from your experiences, from your fears, from your beliefs. If you have learned to expect things to go wrong, your mind will search for signs that confirm that. If you have learned to doubt yourself, your mind will highlight every mistake. If you have learned that you are not enough, your mind will constantly look for proof. Not because it wants to hurt you, but because it wants to stay consistent. Your brain values consistency more than accuracy. It would rather be wrong in a familiar way than uncertain in a new way, so it keeps repeating the same interpretations, even when they make your life harder. This is why two people can experience the same moment and walk away with completely different realities. One sees a setback. The other sees feedback. One sees rejection, the other sees redirection. The event is the same, but the meaning is different, and that meaning creates everything that follows. How you feel, how you respond, what you believe next. Over time, this loop becomes your identity. You begin to think, this is just how I am. This is just how life feels. But what you are really experiencing is a pattern that has been repeating long enough to feel permanent. And once something feels permanent, you stop questioning it, you stop noticing it, you accept it as truth. That is where the loop becomes invisible. You are no longer aware that you are interpreting. You believe you are simply seeing reality as it is, but you are not. You are seeing reality through a lens. And that lens is shaped by your past, your fears, your expectations, your unconscious habits. The more you look through that lens, the more it defines your world, until your entire life feels consistent with it. If your lens is heavy, everything feels heavy. If your lens is uncertain, everything feels unstable. If your lens is critical, nothing ever feels enough. And because the outside world reflects what you expect, the loop strengthens. You see what you expect, and then you believe what you see. This is how people get stuck, not because they lack ability, not because they lack opportunity, but because they are trapped inside a way of seeing that they believe is reality. And here is the shift that changes everything. You are not stuck in your life. You are stuck in your interpretation of your life. That is a completely different problem and a completely different solution, because if the problem were your life, you would need to change everything outside. But if the problem is your interpretation, you only need to change how you see. That is a much quieter shift, but it is far more powerful, because the moment you begin to see the loop, you begin to step outside of it. At first, it feels small. You notice a thought, and instead of believing it immediately, you pause. You ask, is this actually true? Or is this just my usual way of seeing things? That pause is everything, because it interrupts the loop. It creates space between the event and your interpretation of it. And in that space, you have a choice. You can continue the same pattern, or you can see it differently. That is where change begins. Not in dramatic actions, not in forcing yourself to think positive, but in simply noticing that what you are experiencing is not reality itself. It is your interpretation of it. The more you notice this, the more the loop weakens. The more space you create, the lighter everything begins to feel, not because your life changed, but because you stopped adding unnecessary weight to it. And slowly, almost quietly, your experience of life begins to shift. The same situations appear, but they no longer carry the same pressure. The same challenges exist, but they no longer feel overwhelming, because you are no longer trapped inside the first thought that appears. You're no longer inside the loop. You are observing it, and once you can observe it, you're no longer controlled by it. That is the beginning of clarity. That is the beginning of freedom, and most importantly, that is the moment you realize your life has never been as heavy as it felt. It was your interpretation repeating itself again and again until it became your reality. Chapter 3. Why everything feels hard, even when it shouldn't. There are moments in your life when nothing is actually going wrong, and yet everything feels heavy. You look around, nothing is collapsing, nothing is falling apart, nothing is truly urgent. But inside your mind, it feels like too much, too many things to handle, too many decisions to make, too many possibilities to worry about. This is the part that confuses most people. Because if nothing is really wrong, why does it feel like something is? Why does a normal day feel overwhelming? Why does a simple task feel exhausting? Why does your own life sometimes feel like pressure? The answer is not in your circumstances, it is in the way your mind processes those circumstances, because your mind is not designed to make your life feel light. It is designed to keep you safe. And to do that, it constantly scans for what could go wrong. Even when nothing is wrong, it looks for risk, it looks for mistakes, it looks for anything that might threaten your sense of control. And once it finds something, it holds on to it, it zooms in, it replays it, it expands it until it feels bigger than it actually is. This is why your mind can turn something small into something heavy, not because the situation is serious, but because your mind is treating it as if it is. Think about how often this happens. You have a task to complete. It is not that complicated. It does not require anything extraordinary. But instead of just doing it, you start thinking, what if I do it wrong? What if this leads to something bigger? What if I am not ready? And suddenly, a simple task becomes something you avoid. Not because it is difficult, but because your thinking has made it feel difficult. This is how resistance is created. Not in the task itself, but in the story around the task. And the more you repeat that story, the stronger it becomes. Until your mind begins to associate that task with pressure. And once that happens, you are no longer responding to the task. You are responding to the feeling your mind attached to it. This is the hidden layer most people never see. They think they are reacting to life, but they are actually reacting to the emotional weight their thinking has created. And because that weight feels real, they assume it is coming from reality, but it is not. It is coming from interpretation. Your mind is constantly adding layers, layer of meaning, layer of fear, layer of expectation, until what you are facing is no longer just the situation. It is the situation plus everything your mind has added to it. And that combination is what feels overwhelming. This is why everything can feel hard, even when it should not, because you are never dealing with things as they are. You are dealing with things as your mind presents them, and your mind does not present things in a neutral way. It presents them in a way that prepares you for the worst. Even when the worst is unlikely, even when the worst never happens, this is why your energy feels drained. Not because you are doing too much, but because you are thinking too much about what you are doing. You are not just living the moment, you are analyzing it, you are anticipating it, you are trying to control it, and all of that thinking takes energy. A lot of energy, more than the actual action itself. This is why you can feel exhausted, even on days when you have not done much, because your mind has been active, constantly processing, constantly upon predicting, constantly rehearsing. And most of that activity is unnecessary, but it feels necessary because your mind is trying to protect you. It believes that by thinking more, it can prevent problems. It believes that by analyzing everything, it can keep you safe. But in reality, it is creating the very pressure it is trying to avoid. This is the paradox. The more your mind tries to control everything, the heavier everything feels. The more it tries to prepare you, the more it overwhelms you. And the more you believe those thoughts, the more real that overwhelm becomes. This is how people get stuck in cycles of stress, not because their life is unmanageable, but because their thinking is unfiltered. And when thinking is unfiltered, it does not stop. It keeps going from one thought to another, from one worry to the next, until your entire experience of life feels like pressure. But here is the shift. The pressure is not coming from your life. It is coming from your relationship with your thoughts, the way you engage with them, the way you believe them, the way you follow them. If you believe every thought, you will feel every emotion it creates. If you question your thoughts, you begin to separate from those emotions, and that separation is where lightness begins. Because the moment you stop believing everything your mind says, you stop adding unnecessary weight to your life. You begin to see tasks as tasks, not as threats. You begin to see challenges as situations, not as problems. You begin to experience life without the constant layer of resistance. And when that happens, something subtle but powerful changes. You no longer feel like life is against you. You no longer feel like everything is too much. You begin to move through things instead of pushing against them. And that is when you realize that most of what felt hard was never coming from life itself. It was coming from the way your mind was holding it. And once you loosen that grip even slightly, everything begins to feel lighter, not perfect, not effortless, but manageable. And that is enough, because when something feels manageable, you stop resisting it. And when you stop resisting, you stop suffering unnecessarily. That is the beginning of a different experience of life. Not because your circumstances changed, but because your relationship with your thoughts did, and that changes everything. Chapter 4. The moment everything quietly changed. There is no dramatic moment when everything suddenly becomes clear. There is no instant breakthrough where your life transforms overnight. Instead, change begins quietly, almost unnoticeably. It starts with a single question. A question so simple you might ignore it. What if the problem is not my life, but the way I'm looking at it? At first, this question feels uncomfortable because it shifts responsibility. It moves the focus away from everything outside and brings it back to you. Not in a way that blames you, but in a way that gives you power. Because if your life was truly the problem, you would have to change everything around you. But if your perception is the problem, then the shift is already within reach. That realization does not happen all at once. It happens in small moments, moments where you begin to notice something you never noticed before. A thought appears, and instead of immediately believing it, you pause, just for a second. That pause feels strange at first, because you are used to reacting. You are used to following every thought as if it were a command. But now for the first time you are observing it. You are seeing it not as truth, but as something that simply appeared. That is the beginning of awareness, and it changes everything. Because once you can see a thought, you are no longer inside it. You are separate from it, and in that separation, there is space. Space to question, space to choose, space to respond differently. At first, this space is small, almost invisible. A thought appears. You still feel its impact, but there is a slight distance. A small gap between the thought and your reaction. That gap is where change begins. Before there was no gap. Thought appeared. You believed it. You reacted. Now there is a moment in between. A moment where you can see what is happening, and that moment is powerful because it interrupts the pattern. It breaks the automatic cycle. You begin to notice how often your mind jumps to conclusions, how quickly it turns uncertainty into fear, how easily it creates pressure out of something neutral. And the more you notice this, the less control those thoughts have over you. Not because you are forcing them to stop, but because you are no longer blindly following them. There was a moment when this became clear. It was not a big moment. There was no major event, just a simple situation. A small problem, something that would normally trigger stress. The thought appeared. This is too much. This is going to be difficult. And for the first time, instead of accepting that thought, there was a pause. A quiet question, is that actually true? Or is that just how my mind usually reacts? That question changed everything because it revealed something unexpected. The situation itself was not overwhelming. The thought about the situation was. And once that was seen, the feeling began to shift. The pressure softened, the urgency disappeared. the situation became what it actually was. Simple, manageable, neutral. That was the moment everything started to change. Not because life became easier, but because the added weight began to disappear. This is how change really happens. Not through force, not through trying to control every thought, but through understanding. Understanding how your mind works. Understanding how it creates meaning. Understanding how it turns neutral events into emotional experiences. Once you see this clearly, longer need to fight your thoughts. You do not need to silence them. You do not need to replace them with positive ones. You simply need to see them, because a thought that is seen clearly loses its power. It is no longer something you are trapped inside. It becomes something you can observe, and once you can observe it, you can choose whether to engage with it. This is the shift from reacting to observing, from believing to questioning, from being inside the loop to seeing the loop. At first, this shift feels subtle. You still have the same thoughts, you still feel the same patterns, but something is different. You are no longer completely identified with them. You are no longer completely controlled by them. There is distance, and in that distance, there is freedom. The more you practice this, the more that distance grows. Thoughts still appear, but they pass. More quickly, they do not stick the same way. They do not define your experience as strongly. You begin to move through your day differently. Situations that once triggered stress now feel neutral. Things that once felt overwhelming now feel manageable. Not because they changed, but because you did not add extra weight to them, and slowly, almost quietly, your entire experience of life begins to shift. You are still living the same life, but it feels different, lighter, clearer, more spacious. You are no longer constantly trying to control everything. You are no longer reacting to every thought. You are simply experiencing, and that changes everything. Because when you stop resisting your thoughts, you stop creating unnecessary suffering. When you stop believing every interpretation, you stop turning simple moments into heavy ones. And when you stop adding weight, life naturally becomes lighter. This is not something dramatic. It does not happen all at once. It happens gradually, through awareness, through small moments of clarity, through simple questions. But those small moments add up. They change the way you see, they change the way you respond, they change the way you experience everything. And one day you look back and realize, nothing outside has really changed, but everything feels different, because the moment you stopped blindly believing your thoughts was the moment you started to see clearly. And once you see clearly, you cannot go back to the same way of living, because now you know the weight was never in your life. It was in the way you were looking at it. And the moment that changes everything begins to open up. Chapter 5. Step 1. Seeing your thoughts clearly. The first real shift does not come from changing your life. It comes from seeing your mind. Most people try to fix how they feel. They try to control their emotions. They try to force themselves to think positive. They try to replace bad thoughts with better ones. But all of that happens too late. Because by the time you are trying to fix a feeling, the process has already started. The thought has already appeared. The interpretation has already been created. The emotion has already been triggered, and now you are reacting to something that is already in motion. That is why most attempts to change feel exhausting. You are always one step behind. You are trying to fix the result instead of seeing the cause. The cause is always a thought. A simple sentence that appears in your mind, so quickly, so automatically that you rarely notice it. You only notice how you feel. But behind every feeling, there is always a thought. Even if you cannot hear it clearly, it is there, quiet, fast, and constant. If you want to change your experience, you have to start there. You have to begin by seeing your thoughts, not controlling them, not judging them, just seeing them. This sounds simple, but it is not easy, because your mind has been running automatically for years. You are used to being inside your thoughts, not looking at them. You are used to believing them, not observing them. So the first step is not to change anything. It is to slow down enough to notice what is actually happening inside your mind. At the beginning, this will feel unnatural. You might forget to do it. You might get pulled back into thinking that is normal because this is a different way of relating to your mind. Instead of being inside it, you are stepping outside of it. And that shift takes practice. Start with something simple. At any point during your day, pause just for a moment and ask yourself, what am I thinking right now? Not what am I feeling, not what is happening, but what am I actually thinking? You might notice something like, this is too much, I am not ready, I am falling behind, this is going to go wrong. These thoughts have been there the whole time, but now you are seeing them, and the moment you see them, something changes. You are no longer completely inside them, you are aware of them, and that awareness creates distance. A small gap between you and the thought, that gap is everything. Because before there was no gap. The thought appeared, and you became it. Now the thought appears and you can see it. That means you are not the thought. You are the one noticing it. That realization is the beginning of freedom. Not because the thoughts stop, they will not. At least not immediately, but because they no longer have the same control. When you are not aware, your thoughts run everything. They decide how you feel, they decide how you act, they shape your entire experience. But when you are aware, they become just one part of your experience, not the whole thing, and that changes everything because now you have a choice. You can still follow the thought, you can still believe it, but you are no longer forced to. This is where the practice begins. Not in changing your thoughts, but in noticing them. Again and again throughout your day. In small moments, when something feels heavy, pause and ask, what am I thinking right now? When something feels stressful, pause and ask, what is the story in my head? When something spiritual feels overwhelming, pause and ask, what am I adding to this situation? These questions are simple, but they are powerful because they bring your attention to the source instead of the result. And the more you do this, the clearer your thinking becomes. You start to notice patterns. You start to see the same types of thoughts repeating over and over, the same fears, the same doubts, the same assumptions. You realize that many of your thoughts are not new. They are habits, they are patterns your mind has learned, and once you see them as patterns, they begin to lose their power, because something that is seen clearly is easier to question, and something that is questioned is no longer automatically believed. This is how awareness works. It does not fight your mind, it reveals it. It shows you what is already happening, so you are no longer unconsciously or just controlled by it. And as this awareness grows, your experience begins to shift. You still have thoughts, but they feel lighter. They pass more quickly. They do not stick the same way because you are not holding on to them. You are seeing them and letting them move. This is the first step. Seeing your thoughts clearly, not changing them, not fixing them, just seeing them. Because once you can see, you can understand. And once you understand, you no longer feel trapped. The weight begins to lift. Not because your life has changed, but because you are no longer lost inside your own thinking. And that is where everything starts to become lighter. That is where everything starts to open up. Not through force, but through awareness. And once you truly begin to see your thoughts, you realize something very simple. They were never as solid as they felt. They were never as true as they seemed. They were just patterns repeating until you finally noticed them. And that moment, when you begin to notice, is the moment everything begins to change. Chapter 6. Step 2. Breaking the interpretation. Once you begin to see your thoughts clearly, something else becomes obvious. You have been choosing the same meanings over and over again, not consciously, but automatically. Every situation in your life is neutral at first. It simply happens, but your mind does not leave it that way. It immediately assigns meaning, and that meaning shapes everything that follows. How you feel, how you respond, what you believe next. This is the interpretation loop. And once you see it, the next step is not to stop thinking. It is to question the meaning you're giving to things. Because most of the time, the meaning you assign is not the only possible meaning. It is just the one you are used to. Think about how quickly your mind labels things. Something does not go as planned, and your mind says, "This is bad." Something takes longer than expected, and your mind says, "I am falling behind." Someone responds differently than you hoped, and your mind says, "Something is wrong." These interpretations feel immediate, they feel obvious, they feel true. But they are not the only way to see the situation. They are simply the fastest way your mind knows, the familiar way, the automatic way, and the automatic way is often the heaviest one. This is why breaking the loop matters, not by forcing yourself to think positively, but by allowing yourself to see differently. There is always more than one interpretation. Always. The situation does not change, but the meaning can, and that changes everything. The practice here is simple but powerful. When a thought appears, instead of accepting it, immediately pause and ask yourself, is this the only way to see this? Not is this wrong, not is this bad, just is this the and only possible meaning? This question creates space. It loosens the grip of the first interpretation. It reminds you that what you are seeing is not the only version of reality. At first, this might feel strange, because your mind wants certainty. It wants to decide quickly, it wants to move on, but by questioning you interrupt that automatic process. You give yourself a moment to step outside the loop. Let's take a simple example. You make a mistake. Your mind says, "I am not good at this." That feels real. It feels like a fact. But if you pause and ask, is this the only way to see this? Something opens. Another interpretation becomes possible. I am learning. I am early in the process. This is part of improving. The situation did not change, but the meaning did, and that changes how you feel. Instead of pressure, there is space. Instead of doubt, there is direction. This is not about pretending. It is about recognizing that your first interpretation is not always the most accurate. It is just the most familiar. Another example. You feel behind. Your mind says, "Everyone else is ahead of me. I am late. I'm not where I should be." That creates pressure, anxiety, comparison. But if you pause and ask, is this the only way to see this? A different perspective appears. I'm on my own timeline. I'm still moving forward. There is no fixed schedule for growth. Again, nothing outside changed, but everything inside shifted. This is how you break the loop. Not by controlling your thoughts, but by expanding your perspective. By allowing more than one meaning to exist, by not locking yourself into the first interpretation. The more you do this, the weaker the loop becomes. Because the loop depends on certainty. It depends on you believing that your first thought is the truth. When you question it, you break that certainty. You introduce flexibility, and flexibility creates lightness because a rigid mind feels heavy. A mind that only sees one way feels trapped, but a flexible mind, a mind that can see multiple meanings, feels open, feels spacious, feels free. This is not about always choosing the positive meaning. It is about recognizing that you have a choice, that you are not limited to the first interpretation that appears, and that choice changes how you experience everything. You begin to notice that situations are not as fixed as they seemed. They are not as heavy as they felt. They are not as final as you thought. They are simply events waiting for meaning, and you are the one giving that meaning. That is the power you have. Not to control life, but to shape how you experience it. As you continue this practice, something interesting happens. Your reactions slow down. Your emotions become less intense. Not because you are suppressing them, but because you are not feeding them. You are not reinforcing the same interpretations over and over again. You're allowing space for different perspectives, and that space changes everything. You move through your day differently. A problem appears, and instead of reacting immediately, you pause, you look at it, you question it, and often you realize it is not as serious as it first seemed. That realization becomes a habit. And over time, your entire experience of life shifts. Things that once triggered stress now feel manageable. Things that once felt overwhelming now feel neutral because you're no longer locked into a single way of seeing. You're no longer inside the loop. You are moving around it, seeing it from different angles, choosing how to engage with it. This is where real change happens. Not in changing your life, but in changing your relationship with your thoughts. Because once you stop automatically believing your first interpretation, you stop creating unnecessary weight. And when that weight disappears even slightly, life begins to feel different, lighter, clearer, more open. And you begin to realize that the difficulty you felt was never in the situation itself, it was in the meaning you were giving to it. And once that meaning changes, everything else follows. Chapter 7. Step 3. Detaching from your mind. There is a point in this process where something deeper begins to shift, not just how you see your thoughts, but how you relate to them. Up to this point, you have learned to notice your thoughts. You have learned to question your interpretations. But there is one more step, a step that changes everything at the deepest level. You begin to realize that you are not your thoughts. This may sound simple, but it is one of the most powerful shifts you can experience. Because for most of your life, you have been completely identified with your thinking. A thought appears and you believe it. You do not question it. You do not step back from it. You become it. If the thought says, "I am not good enough," you feel not good enough. If the thought says, "This is too much," you feel overwhelmed. If the thought says something is wrong, you feel anxious. This happens so quickly that you never see the separation. There is no distance between you and the thought, but once you begin to observe your thoughts, something becomes clear. Thoughts are not stable. They come and go. They appear and then they disappear. They change constantly. One moment you feel confident. The next moment you feel uncertain. One moment you feel calm. The next moment you feel stressed. If you were truly your thoughts, you would be constantly changing without any control. But there is something that does not change. There is something that is always there, quietly observing. That is you. You are not the thought. You are the one noticing the thought. And that distinction creates freedom, because once you see that you no longer have to follow every thought, you no longer have to believe everything that appears in your mind. You can simply observe it and let it pass. This is what detachment really means. It does not mean suppressing your thoughts. It does not mean getting rid of them. It means not attaching your identity to them. It means recognizing that a thought is just a mental event, not a fact, not a command, not a definition of who you are. At first, this feels unfamiliar because you are used to reacting, you are used to engaging, you are used to following the thought wherever it leads, but now you are doing something different. A thought appears, and instead of stepping into it, you step back. You notice it. You see it clearly. And you say to yourself, "This is just a thought." That sentence is simple, but it changes everything because it breaks the automatic connection between the thought and your reaction. It creates space. And in that space, you are no longer controlled. You are aware. Let's take an example. A thought appears, "I am going to fail." Before you would feel fear, you would start imagining outcomes. You would react as if that thought were true. But now you notice it. You see the thought, and instead of believing it, you say, "This is just a thought." Immediately something shifts. The thought loses intensity. The fear softens. The situation becomes clearer. Not because the thought disappeared, but because you are no longer inside it. You are observing it. This is detachment. It is not about removing thoughts, it is about removing the automatic belief in them. The more you practice this, the more stable you become. Because your state is no longer controlled by every thought that appears, you begin to experience something new. A sense of calm, a sense of space, a sense that you are not constantly being pulled in different directions. Your mind still produces thoughts that does not stop, but they feel different, they feel lighter, they pass more quickly. They do not define your experience because you are no longer attaching to them. You are no longer turning them into reality. This is where true mental freedom begins. Not in controlling your mind, but in no longer being controlled by it. And this changes how you experience everything. Challenges still exist, but they do not overwhelm you. Uncertainty still appears, but it does not create the same fear. You're able to respond instead of react. You're able to see clearly instead of being pulled into every narrative, and over time, this becomes your new way of being. You do not have to remind yourself constantly. You do not have to force it. It becomes natural because you have seen the truth. Thoughts are temporary. They are not who you are. They are not always accurate. They are simply events passing through your awareness, and you are the awareness, not the event. This understanding creates a deep sense of stability, because if you are not your thoughts, then your identity is no longer fragile. It is no longer dependent on what your mind says in any given moment. It becomes something deeper, something more consistent, something that is not constantly shifting. And from that place, you move through life differently. You are less reactive, less defensive, less overwhelmed, not because life has changed, but because your relationship with your mind has. You are no longer caught in every story. You are no longer defined by every thought. You are simply observing, choosing, responding. And that is where everything becomes lighter. Not because the world is easier, but because you are no longer carrying unnecessary weight. You are no longer adding pressure through identification. You are no longer making every thought real. And when that happens, something opens, a sense of clarity, a sense of space, a sense of control, not over life, but over your experience of it. And that is the real shift, not controlling what happens, but understanding how you relate to what happens. And once you see that clearly, you realize something simple. You were never trapped by your life. You were only trapped by your thoughts about it. And the moment you stop identifying with those thoughts is the moment you begin to feel free. That is the beginning of a completely different way of living. A way where your mind no longer controls you. A way where your thoughts no longer define you. A way where you can finally experience life without the constant weight you once believed was unavoidable. Chapter 8. So when you finally see clearly. There is a quiet moment that happens after all of this. It does not arrive with intensity. It does not feel like a breakthrough. It feels simple, almost ordinary, but everything is different. You wake up, the same life is there, the same responsibilities, the same people, the same challenges. Nothing outside has changed, and yet something inside feels lighter, not dramatically, not in a way that is obvious to others, but you can feel it. There is less tension, less urgency, less noise. The constant pressure that used to sit in the background is no longer as strong. It is not completely gone, but it does not control you anymore, and that is the difference. Because before, your entire experience was shaped by your thoughts. Every situation was filtered through interpretation. Every moment was weighed down by meaning. Now you still have your thoughts, but they do not define everything. They come and they go. They appear and they pass. You notice them, but you do not get lost in them. That changes how everything feels. A task is just a task. It is no longer a problem. A challenge is just a situation. It is no longer something to fear. A delay is just time. It is no longer a sign that something is wrong. This is what clarity feels like. It is not excitement. It is not constant happiness. It is space. It is the absence of unnecessary weight. And that space allows you to move differently. You act without overthinking. You decide without constant doubt. You experience without constantly analyzing. Not because you have forced yourself to be different, but because you are no longer adding extra layers to everything you do. There was a time when everything felt like pressure. Even simple things, even things that should have been easy. Your mind turned them into something bigger, something heavier, something more complicated. Now those same things feel manageable, not because they changed, but because you stopped turning them into something else. You see them as they are, and that is enough. This is where most people misunderstand change. They think life becomes easier. They think problems disappear. They think everything becomes smooth. But that is not what happens. Life remains unpredictable. Challenges still appear. Things still go wrong, but your relationship with those things changes. You are no longer fighting everything. You're no longer resisting what is happening. You are no longer adding unnecessary meaning. And because of that, you are no longer suffering in the same way. This is the shift. Life did not become easier. You stopped making it harder. That is the truth most people never see. They keep trying to fix their life. They keep trying to control every outcome. They keep trying to eliminate difficulty. But the real shift is not in control. It is in understanding. Understanding how your mind creates your experience. Understanding how interpretation shapes everything. Understanding how identification creates weight. Once you see that clearly, deeply, you cannot go back. Because now you notice things you never noticed before. You see how quickly your mind tries to label situations. You see how it tries to predict outcomes. You see how it adds meaning where none is needed. And instead of following that process, automatically you observe it. You let it pass. You choose how to respond. That choice is what changes everything. It gives you a sense of control, not over life, but over your experience of life. And that is far more powerful, because life will always be uncertain. You cannot control everything that happens, but you can understand how you respond. You can understand how you interpret. You can understand how you think. And that understanding creates stability. A kind of stability that does not depend on circumstances. A kind of stability that remains even when things are not perfect. You begin to trust yourself differently. Not because you believe everything will go right, but because you know you will not turn every situation into unnecessary suffering. You know you can handle your thoughts. You know you can step back. You know you can see clearly. And that confidence is quiet. It does not need to prove anything. It does not need to control everything. It simply exists in the background, supporting you, guiding you, allowing you to move through life with less resistance. And that is what most people are really looking for. Not a perfect life, not constant success, but a sense of ease. A sense that life is not constantly against them. A sense that things are manageable. That is what clarity gives you. Not perfection, but peace. Not control, but understanding. Not certainty, but stability. And from that place, everything begins to feel different. The same life, but experienced in a completely different way. Because the quality of your life has never been determined by what happens to you. It has always been determined by how you experience what happens. And that experience comes from your thinking, not your circumstances. Once you see that fully, there is nothing else to chase. There is nothing else to fix. There is only something to understand. And that understanding changes everything. Not loudly, not suddenly, but quietly, consistently, in a way that reshapes your entire experience. You stop asking, why is this so hard? And you begin to see it was never that hard. It only felt that way because of how you were thinking. And now that thinking has changed, and because of that, everything feels different. That is the shift. That is the clarity. That is the moment when you finally see that life was never the weight. The weight was the way you were carrying it. And once you stop carrying it that way, everything begins to open. Everything begins to soften. Everything begins to make sense. And from that point forward, you are no longer trying to fix your life. You are simply living it with clarity, with space, with a mind that no longer turns everything into something it was never meant to be. The quiet truth most people miss. There is something almost invisible about this shift. No one around you may notice it. Your life may look exactly the same from the outside. The same routines, the same responsibilities, the same challenges, but inside everything is different. You are no longer fighting every moment. You are no longer reacting to every thought. You are no longer turning every situation into something heavier than it needs to be. And because of that, life begins to feel lighter, not perfect, not effortless, but clear. There is space where there used to be pressure. There is calm where there used to be noise. There is understanding where there used to be confusion. And the most important part, you begin to trust yourself. Not because you control everything, but because you understand how your mind works. You know that thoughts will come. You know that interpretations will appear, but you also know you do not have to believe them. That changes everything, because once you stop believing every thought, you stop creating unnecessary suffering. Once you stop adding meaning to everything, you stop carrying weight that was never yours. And once you stop resisting every moment, you begin to move with life instead of against it. Life was never trying to overwhelm you. It was never trying to make things harder. It was simply happening. And your mind was turning it into something else. But now you see it. You see the pattern. You see the loop. You see the space between you and your thoughts. And that space is where your freedom lives, not in changing everything around you, but in understanding what is happening within you. That is the quiet truth most people miss. They spend their entire lives trying to fix the, say, outside, without ever realizing that the real shift was always inside. And the moment you truly understand this, you stop searching for a different life. You start experiencing your current life differently. You stop asking, why is everything so hard? And you begin to see it was never meant to feel that way. It only felt that way because of how you were carrying it, and now you are no longer carrying it the same way. So things begin to soften, things begin to open, things begin to feel lighter, not because life changed, but because you did. And this is not the end of the journey, it is the beginning. Because once you see your mind clearly, you begin to understand yourself more deeply. And once you understand yourself, you begin to experience life in a completely different way. More present, more aware, more free. And from here, everything you thought was fixed begins to expand. Everything you thought was heavy begins to dissolve. Everything you thought was difficult begins to make sense. So do not try to control everything. Do not try to force your life into perfection. Just begin by noticing. Just begin by seeing. Just begin by understanding. Because that is where everything starts. And once it starts, it never truly stops. It only deepens. And that is how everything changes quietly from the inside out.